can share my slides. All right. And hopefully you can see some slides.
They look brilliant. Carry on.
All right. Well, thank you very much for inviting me along to talk about the FAIR4 Software Working Group and the recommendation of the FAIR4 Software Principles that has gone into community review today. I note that there are some people who've been involved in this work on the call, and in particular, Daniel Katz presented these slides when we previously came to the organizational assembly. So I will be going over a little bit of what he presented back last June, and then also update you on what's been happening since then and the wrap up of the FAIR4 Software Group as well. So that is pretty much what I'm going to say. I'll go on and talk a little bit about what the FAIR4 Software Working Group is, and then talk about the recommendation itself, and then outline some next steps. Okay, so the motivation behind the FAIR4 Software Working Group is that we don't think that software is just another type of data. There are certain characteristics of it which mean that it's worthwhile considering it, particularly when it comes to the FAIR principles, as something in its own right. Now, what we've been doing as a working group is really looking to build on a number of the different recommendations that have come out of some of the different task forces that have been looking at the application of the FAIR principles to research, and also the implementation and adoption of FAIR practice. And if you look back at the original FAIR principles, they are intended to apply to all digital objects. And this includes other types of FAIR that we're starting to see come up as well, more of which later. But in our case, what we convened was a joint working group between the Research Data Alliance, Force 11, and the Research Software Alliance that aimed to take the FAIR principles and understand how they could be applied to software, and then understand how they could be adopted by people who are looking to implement the FAIR principles for research software. It was officially endorsed in September 2020, which now feels like a lifetime ago. But remarkably, that means that we are more or less on track for the 18 months timeline that we have around these working groups. If you want to find out more about the working group, the case statement is at the link on the slide. And as Shelley mentioned, I put the link to these slides in the notes. The one thing I did want to highlight, though, is that this has really been a huge community activity, and we couldn't have done it without all of the members of the community who were active in this working group. There were 250 members in the working group who read documents, and there've been 80 active contributors who've been part of the different subgroups that I'll talk about, or contributing comments, or engaging in the discussions, the webinars, and the calls. So it really has been a very widespread community activity. So the way that we did this is that we broke the work into different subgroups. Dan has already reported on the first 4 subgroups that ran during June to December 2020, which were all really looking at taking into account the existing material and understanding where, for instance, the FAIR principles sat alongside, for software sat alongside other contexts, or looking at what's changed in the landscape since the FAIR principles were first published. Following those subgroups work, we went through a number of different community exercises and the first draft of the FAIR principles. And subsequent to that, we set up another set of 3 subgroups, which ran from September 2021 to January 2022, looking at adoption guidelines. So trying to identify where people had already created guidance that helped facilitate the adoption of FAIR4 Software Principles. Adoption support, working with people who are early adopters of the FAIR4 Software Principles to capture their work, capture their experiences, and write them up as case studies. And governance, which was looking to understand the future of the FAIR4 Software Principles, particularly what happens to them after their first release, and how they get reviewed, and how we ensure that we understand when they are still relevant. So all of these three subgroups have contributed additional outputs which are getting published, which are fed into the whole process of developing the FAIR4Research principles. And those principles themselves have gone through an extensive set of community reviews. We have a drafting group drawn from the working group members who've been shepherding this process, and it's gone through a number of consultations through the last year and a half. We've given a lot of webinars and presentations, and it's gone through, as mentioned, this initial first RDA community review. So why are we bringing this back to RDA for a second review, you might ask? So one of the bits of feedback that we got as part of the first review and some of the regional webinars was that there was still a little bit of work to be done to simplify the principles, to make them easier for implementers to understand and use. In the document that was presented in the first community review, we combined the principles alongside the process of development and our thoughts on challenges to adoption. What we've done in this document, this new version, is restructure it and simplify it. So whilst the principles remain broadly similar, the only changes being to clarify some of the vagaries of the English language by making things more consistent in things like tense and plurality. The actual principles have remained almost identical to the ones that went through the first community review. What we've changed is extensively revised the explanatory text. So we've taken on board the comments that came up, and we've tried to make the way that we couch the principles and help people understand how they should be implemented much clearer. Trying to ensure that we give examples for terminology that perhaps is less familiar from those outside of the RDA and research software communities, and ensuring that we've split apart the different purposes of the document so that what remains really is focusing on the principles themselves. Some of the other parts of the document will be published separately. There's going to be a scientific data paper that's just been submitted on the application and adoption of principles, including some of these use cases. And there will be some supplementary outputs from the working groups to capture the process of the development of the principles. So yeah, what are the principles themselves? Here are the FAIR4Research software principles. I'm not going to ask you to read them all just now, but what I will highlight is that, broadly speaking, we have sought to keep the spirit of the FAIR principles for data and ensure that they are translated to particular parts of what make research software unique. So in particular, there are some sub-principles looking at things like the levels of granularity and how different components of software relate to each other, acknowledging that there are many different versions of software and how those relate to each other, and ensuring that we understand the role that community standards, both programming standards, format standards, and disciplinary standards, feed into what is expected of FAIR software. One thing that we've kept is that we're still saying that software should be given a clear and accessible license rather than saying that it should have an open license. We're following the ethos of the original FAIR principles that things should be as open as possible and as closed as necessary. And I think all in all, what we are expecting is that in terms of the second community review, that we get more comments around endorsement, so understanding how people can implement rather than significant changes to the FAIR principles, given that this is now effectively the 5th round of community review that these principles have had. So they have been developed in sight of the entire community. So what's the next steps? So as I mentioned, with the publishing and final community review of this output, the FAIR4RESearch Software Working Group is wrapping up its work. We will be publishing the final subgroup outputs from the working group and continuing to publicize the principles and encouraging adoption, including highlighting some of the early adopters of the FAIR4RESearch Software Principles. We've also established a maintenance plan for the work. In particular, the software source code interest group will be hosting this maintenance plan, and that includes a formal timeline for a review, which the Research Software Alliance has committed to facilitating in a couple of years' time. So separate from that, there's two other things that I'll mention there on what the next steps are for FAIR4RESearch software outside of the working group. One is the FAIR4RESearch software roadmap work that is being facilitated by the Research Software Alliance, which is spinning out a number of different activities, including FAIR for Machine Learning, working groups on metrics and life sciences, and FAIR for VREs, to examine the different additional working groups. So what comes after the FAIR4RESearch software working group that will help take forward the adoption, the implementation, and the guidance around the FAIR principles for research software. Also allied to this are our work on FAIR4RESearch software skills and training curriculums, courses, guidance, and training materials. And then finally, there are a number of projects that have been recently funded, including, but not exclusively, FAIR Impact and Go FAIR software badging, that are looking to take forward particular parts of this roadmap with funded activity to increase, for instance, tooling and resources, and looking at metadata and metrics. So all of this is the road forward for FAIR4RESearch software. And I think where we are now with this community review is the beginning of the end of this first stage of the FAIR4RESearch software principles, and the beginning of the wrapping up of the FAIR4RESearch software working group within the RDA. So finally, what are we looking for assistance from organizational assembly members? So one thing that we're asking you is to consider what events might benefit from FAIR4RESearch software workshops. Which communities do you think haven't already received the sort of dissemination around the FAIR4RESearch software principles and might benefit from it? And you can see a list of the current and past activities that we've been doing there on the community engagement pages. Likewise, if your organization is interested in seeing how they might implement or adopt the principles and would like to comment on what's perhaps missing in terms of adoption guidance, please do get in touch with any of the group leaders and let us know how we can perhaps assist with the adoption of the principles or a review of the principles within your community. And finally, if there are ways that you would like to engage going forward with some of these activities, I do encourage you to support some of the working groups that might come from after this. So if you're interested in things such as virtual research environments or machine learning and the application of the FAIR principles towards these two subsets of FAIR4RESearch software, then please do get involved with the activities that are starting up in those areas. And with that, I'm going to just say thank you to all of the members and contributors to the working group and to the principles, to the present and past steering committee members for making this a really pleasurable experience to work on, and to the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation and Wellcome Trust for their support for some of the webinars and events that we've been running over the last 18 months. And I'll turn it back to you, Shelley.
This is always exciting to hear because I do participate with Neil on the Force 11 work and have seen this all growing, and very, very much supportive of everything here. So does anyone have any questions? Does anybody see this valuable to your community? Maybe you need your own presentation for your own community.
Sorry, this is Dawei. I have a question. So, so how did you guys work with the FAIR Principles community? Like, what is the relationship between the two communities?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it was really interesting because so we had some members of the original FAIR Principles paper participate in both our working group. So Mark Wilkinson was involved in some of the early work alongside a number of the other co-authors. So they played a big role in the early part, sort of first sets of subgroup activities to help give us some of the background to why they did things in a particular way. One thing that I will never forget is that when we were going through some of this work, we were wondering why they had switched the order of data and metadata on one of the principles, and we thought it must be highly significant. And we found out directly from them that that's just a typo, effectively. So we were placing great significance on something where they just accidentally not reversed something. But more recently, I think one of the things that's been very valuable is to get their feedback as the principles have been drafted and comment on the different kind of like wording of how they did it, and in particular how to ensure that it's easier to adopt the FAIR principles. So I think yeah, we've had a lot of good input from them. One last thing before I pass over to Dan, though, is as part of the work that we were doing on the subgroup to do with governance, one of the things we were looking at was how we could come up with a governance plan for the FAIR for Research software principles that acknowledge some of the problems that I think we do still have with the governance for the FAIR principles for research data, and ensure that there is a process that comments after the publication of the first version come out get fed back into what might be future iterations if necessary. So I think that's something that's been really interesting to talk to some of the people involved with the original principles and subsequently in the Go FAIR work as well. Dan, do you want to chip in with some of that?
Yeah, if I'm allowed to kind of wear two hats here, shall I? I'm not sure. Okay, so yeah, so I was just going to say that I guess kind of following on what Neil was saying, it was interesting to talk to some of the people involved in the original FAIR principles and to hear about things that they would do differently today than they had done at that point. But the fact that there's this published paper kind of meant that we were more or less stuck with what the paper said. So that, I think that was one thing, was just that we, in some sense, from coming behind that group, we were able to understand some of the things that didn't go as well and try to do them somewhat better. The other thing I think that's interesting is that there's, and this has been kind of discussed in a bunch of different FAIR events over the last year or so. There's a lot of different FAIR activities going on now for different kinds of products, at least 5 or 6, I think, that I can think of, and maybe more than that. And so there is this interesting question about how do these things all come together at some point, or what is the overlap between all of them? And it seems like at this point there's overlap in people, but there's not necessarily overlap in text, which maybe means that none of the existing text is exactly right, and we need to kind of come back to this and try to figure out how do we actually kind of merge these things back into some set of generic enough principles that they actually can apply to all products, rather than having fairly different principles that apply to different products.